She had 30 seconds to disappear before the most dangerous man in Seoul realized he loved her, and by the time he understood it, her suitcase was already at the door, her hand already on the handle, her heart already breaking quietly enough that he almost missed it. Somewhere behind that door, Seo Junwoo stood frozen in a hallway that still smelled like her perfume, staring at a life he had built out of steel and silence, watching it threaten to walk out of his reach forever. One wrong breath, one more second of hesitation, and she would be gone, and he would have no one to blame but himself. Welcome to AfroKorea TV. Please like, share, and subscribe. The rain fell over Seoul like static, blurring neon into rivers of color along the wet pavement, and 2 streets away gunfire cracked through the night like the city itself was breaking apart. Destiny ran, lungs burning, heels forgotten somewhere behind her, blood sliding warm down her arm where a stray bullet had grazed her. She didn't know whose war she'd stumbled into. She only knew that if she stopped running, she might not get back up. The service door of an unmarked club appeared like salvation, and she threw herself through it, stumbling into a hallway of dim gold light and absolute silence, a silence so complete it felt like stepping into another world entirely. Her knees buckled. The floor rushed up to meet her. She never hit it. A pair of arms caught her, steady and sure, and the last thing she saw before her vision blurred was a man's face, sharp-jawed, dark-eyed, utterly still in a way that should have terrified her and instead, inexplicably, made her feel safe. "Someone get a medic," he said, and though his voice was quiet, the men around him moved like the words were gunfire themselves. He didn't know her name yet. He only knew that his hands that had ended men without a flicker of hesitation, hands that had signed death warrants over breakfast, were suddenly, impossibly gentle as he pressed a cloth to the wound on her arm. Something in his chest, buried under a decade of blood and command, shifted like a fault line splitting open for the first time. The next morning, Destiny woke to sunlight slicing gold through floor-to-ceiling windows, the sheets beneath her impossibly soft, her arm bandaged with a precision that spoke of either a very expensive doctor or a man who had done this 100 times before. She sat up too fast, head spinning, and found a man standing at the window with his back to her. Phone pressed to his ear, voice low and clipped in a tone that made the hair on her arms rise. "If the shipment isn't secured by dawn, I want names. I want addresses. I want to know whose mistake this was before I decide how forgiving I'm feeling." A pause. "Good." He ended the call and turned, and for just a moment, one unguarded moment before the mask slid back into place, something in his expression softened at the sight of her awake. "You're safe," he said simply. "No one touches what's under my roof." Destiny pulled the blanket tighter around herself, pulse hammering. "I don't even know your name." "Seo Junwoo," he said, and the way the 2 guards stationed silently by the door straightened at the sound of it told her everything the introduction itself hadn't. She should have been afraid. She noted distantly that she wasn't. Later that day, a doctor came to check her wound, a real one, not just a man who'd played medic, and confirmed she'd been lucky. An inch to the left, and the story would have ended in that alley instead of this penthouse. Destiny listened with her arms wrapped around her knees, watching Junwoo through the open door as he paced the hallway, phone pressed to his ear again, voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I don't care whose territory it crossed into," he was saying. "A civilian was hit. Find out who fired, and bring them to me. Personally." A civilian. That was her. She wondered, with a strange detached calm, what exactly "bring them to me personally" meant for whoever had pulled that trigger, and decided she didn't want to know. When he came back into the room, his expression had smoothed back into that unreadable stillness, but his eyes lingered on her bandaged arm a beat too long. "I'm sorry," he said. It sounded like a word he didn't use often. "For what?" "You didn't shoot me." "For the world I run through," he said, "spilling over into yours." A few days later, Destiny insisted on leaving. Her apartment was small and unremarkable and entirely hers, and she needed, desperately, to remember what normal felt like after 48 hours inside a world of marble floors and armed men who called a stranger, sir, like it was scripture. Junwoo didn't stop her, not physically. He never once raised a hand to keep her there, never once blocked the door. But there was a car waiting downstairs before she'd even finished packing her bag. A driver instructed, she'd learn later, to make sure she gets wherever she needs to go, safely, every day, for as long as necessary. And tucked into the side pocket of her bag, she found a phone she hadn't packed, already charged, already programmed with exactly one contact. She told herself it was overbearing. She told herself, several times, in several different tones of voice, that she didn't like it. She told herself a lot of things over the following week that turned out to be lies the moment she caught herself dialing that single save number just to hear his voice answer on the second ring, low and immediate, like he'd been waiting for the call. Destiny. Just her name. Nothing else. And somehow it was enough to make her chest ache. I was just checking the phone worked, she lied. It works, he said, and she could hear, impossibly, something like a smile in his voice. Try it again tomorrow. That evening, she went back to work at the small noodle shop tucked into a side street off the main road. The same job she'd had for 2 years, the same apron, the same chipped counter, trying, with everything in her, to fold herself back into the shape of a life that made sense. She was halfway through the dinner rush when the bell over the door chimed, and she looked up to find CEO Junwoo folding himself into the corner booth like he belonged there, like he hadn't spent the last week running an empire built on fear and blood. He ordered black bean noodles. He didn't ask her to sit with him. He simply stayed, quiet, present, a dark and gravitational weight in the corner of an otherwise ordinary room, and Destiny found her eyes drifting to him between tables more times than she'd ever admit. It was near closing when a customer 3 drinks past sober grabbed her wrist too hard as she cleared his table, fingers digging in, breath sour with soju. Just being friendly, he slurred, grip tightening as she tried to pull away. Junwoo was across the room before she'd even finished flinching. The man's arm twisted behind his back with a speed and precision that made the whole restaurant go silent. Junwoo's voice, when it came, was terrifyingly calm. Touch her again, he said quietly, close to the man's ear, and I'll make sure that hand never works right again. The man went white, stammered an apology, and stumbled out into the night, without looking back. Destiny stood frozen behind the counter, pulse hammering, not from fear of the drunk, and not, she realized with a jolt, from fear of Junwoo either. From something else entirely. Something reckless and warm that had watched him defend her and felt, God help her, pleased. You didn't have to do that, she said when he returned to his booth, voice unsteady. I know, he said, picking his chopsticks back up like nothing had happened at all. I wanted to. By the end of the week, he was simply everywhere in the quiet, persistent way of a man who had never learned how to want something halfway. Flowers arrived at the noodle shop that she hadn't ordered and couldn't return. A new lock appeared on her apartment door, installed while she was at work. No note, no explanation needed. Some nights she'd glance out her window at 2 a.m. and see an unmarked black car parked across the street, engine idling, a shadow behind the wheel that didn't need a name. She should have been furious. Any reasonable woman would have been furious. Instead, she found herself watching for his headlights before she even realized she was doing it. You can't just insert yourself into my life like this, she snapped at him one night, arms crossed, chin lifted in the kind of defiance that felt, even to her, a little performative. He'd shown up outside the shop again, waiting to walk her the 4 blocks home, even though nothing had happened in days. Junwoo studied her the way she imagined he studied a difficult negotiation, carefully, thoroughly, like she was the one unsolved problem in an empire he otherwise controlled completely. I don't know how to want something halfway, he said finally. I never have. I've tried, the last few days, to convince myself to stay away from you. I'm not very good at lying to myself. Something in her chest cracked open at that, small and dangerous. That's not an excuse, she said, but her voice had lost its edge. No, he agreed. It's a confession. The following weekend, an invitation arrived, thick cream cardstock, gold lettering, a gala thrown by one of Junwoo's rivals, a wealthy businessman named Han Taemin whose smile, Destiny would learn, was a warning in itself. Junwoo hadn't wanted her there. He'd said as much, flatly, more than once. But she'd insisted, curious despite herself about the world that swallowed his days, and eventually he'd relented on the single condition that she stayed within his sight the entire night. She lasted 20 minutes before Taemin found her alone near the bar, his hand sliding too familiar along the small of her back, his cologne cloying, his voice smooth as oil. "You're new," he said, eyes tracing her like an appraisal. "Junwoo doesn't usually bring dates. You must be special." "I'm not his date," Destiny said, stepping back, but his hand followed, fingers closing around her wrist. "Then there's no harm in—" Across the room, Junwoo's glass nearly shattered in his grip. He crossed the floor in seconds, and though his voice stayed level when he spoke, the temperature of the entire room seemed to drop. "She's not part of tonight's negotiations, Taemin," Junwoo said, sliding an arm possessively around Destiny's waist, his eyes never once leaving his rival's face. "Find another way to insult me." Taemin's smile didn't waver, but something calculating moved behind his eyes as he stepped back, hands raised in mock surrender. "Careful, Junwoo. A man who shows the world what he's afraid to lose only teaches his enemies where to aim." The warning hung in the air long after Taemin had melted back into the crowd. Later that night, in the back of the car, the city sliding past in smears of light, Destiny turned to look at Junwoo, breath still uneven. "You were jealous," she said. "I was protective," he corrected, jaw tight, eyes fixed straight ahead. "That's not the same thing." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the hum of the engine and the rain beginning again against the windows. "With you," he said finally, quietly, like the admission cost him something, "I'm not sure there's a difference anymore." Destiny said nothing, because there was nothing safe left to say, and instead let her hand find his on the seat between them, fingers lacing together in the dark. A few weeks later, the walls between them had worn thin enough to feel almost translucent. He'd taken to showing up at odd hours with food she hadn't asked for and stories about his day he hadn't planned on telling, small, unguarded pieces of himself he doled out like he wasn't quite sure he was allowed to. She'd started leaving her door unlocked for him, without admitting to herself why. A storm rolled over Seoul one night in late autumn, thunder rattling the penthouse windows where she'd fallen asleep on his couch waiting for him to finish a call. She woke to find him kneeling in front of her, having draped a blanket over her without waking her, his expression caught in an unguarded moment of something raw and unnamed. "You didn't have to stay up," she murmured, still half asleep. "I wanted to watch you sleep," he admitted, and then seemed almost startled by his own honesty. "That sounds worse out loud than it did in my head." She laughed, soft and warm, and reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw like she was memorizing it. "No," she said. "It sounds exactly right." His hand came up to cover hers, holding it against his cheek, and for a long moment neither of them moved, caught in the quiet gravity building between them. "I've buried men who crossed me and felt nothing," he said, voice low, forehead dropping to rest against hers. "You look at me like I'm something worth saving, and it terrifies me more than any enemy I've ever faced." "Then stop being terrified," she breathed, "and just choose me." What followed was not something words could hold. The slow, trembling surrender of two people who had each spent a lifetime guarding themselves finally choosing to be undone by each other. The storm outside softened into rain. The room fell into a silence, too intimate to describe, filled with warmth and breathless closeness and a tenderness neither of them had known they were starving for. Morning arrived quietly, tangled sheets and gray light, and a peace that felt, for the first time in either of their lives, entirely earned. The next morning, Destiny woke wrapped in his arms and panicked. It hit her all at once, the weight of what this was, what it meant, what it would cost. A man like him didn't get to keep soft things. Enemies existed to take what mattered most, and she had just made herself the most valuable thing in his world. She thought of Taemin's warning at the gala. A man who shows the world what he's afraid to lose only teaches his enemies where to aim, and something cold settled in her chest. She dressed quietly in the gray dawn light, careful not to wake him, telling herself distance was survival, telling herself leaving now was the safest thing she could do for both of them. Junwoo woke to an empty bed like a physical blow. For the first time in years, the man who controlled every variable in his empire had lost the one thing that actually mattered, and he hadn't even seen it slipping through his fingers. He called her 4 times before noon. She didn't answer once. That afternoon, word reached him through his second-in-command, delivered with the careful stillness of a man bringing news he knew would detonate. Tae-min, the man said. He's been asking questions. About her. Where she works, where she lives, who she is to you. Junwoo's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. How long? Since the gala. Junwoo closed his eyes for a single, controlled breath. He thought of Destiny's empty side of the bed. He thought of Taemin's smile, sharp as a blade dressed up in silk. He thought, with a cold and absolute clarity, that he had made exactly the mistake his rival had warned him about. He had shown the world the one thing he couldn't survive losing, and now that world was circling. Find her, he said quietly. Now. And put twice the men on her as we discussed. By evening, Destiny still hadn't answered his calls, holed up instead in her apartment with the new lock bolted and the curtains drawn, trying to convince herself that walking away this morning had been the responsible thing to do, the safe thing, the thing that would protect them both. She didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway outside her door until it was far too late to matter. The lock, the expensive one Junwoo had installed himself, held for exactly 11 seconds under the crowbar before it gave, and by the time Destiny turned from the window, there were already 2 men in her apartment, and neither of them had come to talk. Mr. Han sends his regards, one of them said, almost pleasant about it, as the other moved toward her. She had time for exactly one scream before a hand closed over her mouth, and the last thing she saw as the world went dark at the edges was her phone, lit up on the counter, Junwoo's name flashing across the screen for the 5th unanswered call of the day.